evening. You're on the smoking section with Stephen Helfer, and today is the 27th of December, so we're getting, I think this will be the last episode of the smoking section until the new year, 2018, because if my numbers are correct, this coming Monday will be the first of the new year. And of course, we in the smokers' rights advocacy community are hoping that 2018 will be a decent year for those of us who want to smoke, and we're not completely sanguine about events. We realize that we're fighting a global effort, campaign, that I would say is really aimed not at smoking itself, but at the culture of smoking and those people who choose to smoke, presumably because they get some benefit from it. And as I've said on this program before many times, I think there are many people whose lives without tobacco would be severely deprived. The tobacco helps smooth and enable them to face the many vicissitudes we face in life. And not only that, but to help be creative, particularly in the field of literature. So many great writers and orators and artists have found that tobacco heightens their ability to produce, their ability to create. And one of those, of course, who has been our smoker of the week before, probably more than once as a matter of fact, is Winston Churchill. And I was very eager to see a new movie, a new biopic of his that called The Darkest Hour, and starring Gary Oldman. And according to something that Gary Oldman said, he spent about, I think he gave a figure about $18,000 worth of cigars to make the movie, because of course probably these kinds of cigars that Winston Churchill smoked were very, very large cigars, and probably the movie makers got nothing but the best. And I saw the movie and it was great, and certainly Winston Churchill smoked constantly during the movie, and in real life he was supposed to have smoked 300,000 cigars during his lifetime. That was an estimate made by the New York Times, so I would assume that they made some kind of reasonable effort to get that correct. And he lived to 90, died in about 1968. So for someone to live to be 90 in 1968 was probably well above the average life expectancy for a non-smoker. And let's see if we can pull up good old Winston here and get him on the screen for us. And it was interesting because this, I read a review of this movie in the New Yorker, and the New Yorker noted that when John Lithgow depicted Winston Churchill in another movie called The Crown, he actually smoked some kind of innocuous and therefore disgusting vegetable substitute instead of smoking tobacco, because according to this reviewer in the New Yorker, tobacco is now taboo. And the reviewer goes, "Brave is the doctor who would have dared to propose such a ruse to Churchill himself." And of course, Churchill really was pitted against Adolf Hitler in Germany. And Adolf Hitler, as everyone knows, was an extreme anti-smoker. So we had a smoker versus an anti-smoker, and of course, Adolf Hitler could not stand the stress of the war and really crumbled, whereas Churchill, an inveterate cigar smoker, was able to withstand such stress. And there is a writer named Compton Mackenzie who is also very literary and wrote many books, but one of the books he wrote was extolling the benefits of tobacco. And he actually posited that he thinks that the reason that Ulysses S. Grant was ultimately able to defeat Robert E. Lee was because Grant was a cigar smoker and Lee was a lifelong non-smoker. And of course, in these days where tobacco is taboo, at the end of the movie there is a disclaimer which is kind of silly, and it says, quote, "The depictions of tobacco smoking contained in this film are based solely on artistic considerations and are not intended to promote tobacco consumption. The Surgeon General has determined that there are serious health risks associated with smoking and secondhand smoke." But of course, as those of us who are baby boomers and who were brought up in a very, very smoky environment, and of course, as anybody who associated with Winston Churchill or lived through the war years, the amount of secondhand smoke they were exposed to was incredible, and yet, as has been noted, there are incidents of many of the illnesses we associate today, like asthma, were far less than what has happened in recent decades when people have been very careful to avoid secondhand smoke. And that kind of brought me to another literary allusion to smoking that I really thought was interesting and kind of fun in the book Kim, which is written by Rudyard Kipling and was written about the turn of the last century, around 1900, I think. A very interesting passage is that they're in a railroad car, and Rudyard Kipling writes, "They all unloosed their bundles and made their morning meal." This is on a railroad car, a passenger railroad car. "Then the banker, the cultivator, and the soldier prepared their pipes and wrapped the compartment in choking acrid smoke, spitting and coughing and enjoying themselves. The Sikh and the cultivator's wife chewed pan, which is a kind of preparation that's very common in India, which they take a leaf, put tobacco and other herbs and spices in it, and they chew it, so it's a form of smokeless tobacco. The lama, which is of course a lama from Tibet, took snuff and told his beads, while Kim, cross-legged, smiled over the comfort of a full stomach." And this reminds me of Oliver Wendell Holmes's comment that fresh air and innocence should be taken in moderation, because he noticed that the most interesting and fulfilling times of life are not in fresh air, but in poor air. And that brings me to, we were in the Somerville City Club the other night. Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights had a little event, and it's a very smoking environment. And I just noticed how relaxed and how pleasant conversation is all over. Whereas today in many of our kind of antiseptic bars and restaurants, the level of pleasure is much less. I think it's palpably smaller, and I think people are less gregarious, far less gregarious. I remember when I worked at Pamplona, and Pamplona was subjected to the smoking ban, a young woman who was from Puerto Rico came up to me and she said, well, she didn't smoke and she didn't care about secondhand smoke, but she was curious why Pamplona, she didn't realize that it was a matter of city ordinance. She was curious why the owner of Pamplona had banned smoking, because she had noticed that ever since smoking was banned in Pamplona, there was a lot less talking and chatting, particularly among people at adjacent tables, and the place just seemed to lose a certain pizzazz that had been there prior to that. And of course, you know, a smoky coffee house or a smoky bar, you know, especially what's sometimes called a dive bar, can have a very, very pleasant and gregarious atmosphere. And I think a lot of the gregariousness has gone out of our public life these days. And I think this is also particularly evident in our government. There is far less gregariousness among people who are perhaps on the opposite side of a political view, but instead of coming together over cigars and cigarettes and smoking back rooms where they can hammer out compromises, everyone, without the benefit of tobacco, it sticks to their own side and can't cross over, can't relax, and can't divest themselves of their own kind of self. They can't see the other side as much. And of course, the American Indian used tobacco in his peace ceremonies and felt that by smoking tobacco, in fact, they would never have a council, they would never consider a peace ceremony or a meeting of a group without tobacco, because they knew, either intuitively or by experience, that tobacco enabled them to see outside themselves, to see the other side of arguments, and to be able to compromise. And I think in many ways in our society now, that's been almost eliminated. In one very interesting way that I, of course, don't have any scientific evidence for, but I just hear on the street so many people beeping their horns at each other. At the moment a person does not take off at the green light, the person behind him will beep. And to me, this indicates that people aren't using tobacco like they used to, don't have that kind of patience that once tobacco helped people with. So we're getting to be a very, very uptight, antiseptic society, and I think I don't see any health benefits. You know, supposedly all of the anti-smokers would say that if the number of people that smoked would be reduced, we would see these vast saving in health expenditures. But in the last 30 years, for example, in Massachusetts in particular, the rate of smoking has declined about 50% or even more, and yet each year health expenditures increase, more people are in hospitals, It seems that more people are getting cancer, unfortunately. They may not be getting as much lung cancer, but it seems they're getting all kinds of cancers. And right now, if I believe the medical expenditures in the state of Massachusetts, the state budget, which I believe is close to about $40 billion a year, from what I understand, 42% of it is devoted to medical costs. So in the last 30 years, the anti-smokers predicted that if they could, by coercion, by spreading unreasonable fear, by punitive taxing, by all kinds of restrictions, which really diminished the autonomy of the individual citizen and the individual business owner, if they could put all these things in and reduce all of these, reduce the smoking rates, that there would be some kind of tremendous windfall that we would see in terms of medical costs. But not only has that not happened, but medical costs have increased and increased, and even the rate of increase has increased. So, this is just one very small example, or maybe it's a large example, of how the anti-smoking campaign has really predicted something that did not come to pass. And of course now, if you say to them, well, where's all the savings? They won't have an answer for you. Now, it's always, the cigarette companies have always never been able to fight with the kind of commitment that the anti-smoking campaign has fought. So that the cigarette companies and the tobacco industry has always been outwitted, in my opinion. They've shown resilience, which of course we know is a good thing, but they've never really been able to speak in such a way that they would be able to carry public opinion. And one of those things that we talked about on the last show that I'm just going to reiterate is that for years the anti-smoking campaign said that the tobacco companies put all kinds of terrible additives in their tobacco, and that this was something that, of course, increased the risk of smoking. Yet, as soon as the tobacco companies stopped doing that, particularly American Spirit Tobacco, the anti-smoking campaign then said, oh, don't let them fool you. Simply because they don't put additives or adulterants in the tobacco does not make it any safer. So even though they were saying for years that it was making it more dangerous, once the tobacco companies stopped, then they said that doesn't make any difference. And now, which I think is a really egregious example of overreach by the Food and Drug Administration, it actually sent a letter to American Spirit, which is owned by R.J. Reynolds, that they could no longer, on their packages, inform the consumer that there is no additives and that the tobacco is natural or organic. And supposedly the reason the FDA is doing this is because this might, even though it is absolutely factually true, somehow giving the factual truth to the public can't handle. Like the Nicholson quote in the movie A Few Good Men, the public can't handle the truth. So they don't want the public to know the truth, that this tobacco is natural and has no additives in it. And I think really there could be some kind of legal challenge to that on the part of the consumer, because I think the consumer has a right to be informed of the truth, and the consumer has a right to make up his or her mind as to how he should proceed from that point. And I think someone should bring a lawsuit against the FDA in this regard. I don't know if I have the tenacity to proceed with this, but in a discussion I had with other people, you know, we have a system here in the United States where even a person with no legal experience and with no money does have access to the courts, and if he's determined and willing to put some work into it, can do some amazing things. I mean, there's a book written, I think, called Gideon's Trumpet, where a prisoner in one of the correctional institutions, doing his own legal work, his own research, filing his own papers, doing all of this kind of stuff, brought a case that went into the United States Supreme Court. So even though people think they have no power, and that sometimes, in my opinion, is simply an excuse to do nothing. Oh, nothing I do makes any difference, therefore I do nothing. And therefore those things that I believe in don't happen, and that confirms that. But if you do something, even if you don't succeed, you make your chances of succeeding much, much higher. And that's why we have Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights. That's why we have established a presence here in Cambridge, and I think a pretty good connection to our city council. I don't think necessarily when we get up there and speak, they are going to all of a sudden turn around and agree with us, but they are at least willing to hear what we say in a city council meeting, and subject themselves to possibly changing their minds about a lot of things. And so I agree, you know, that politics is ugly. It's not, doesn't work well. There's all kinds of bad things about it, particularly here in a democracy. But I also think it's important to make an effort, and I think that effort sometimes succeeds. And I think that politicians are human beings, and human beings have all kinds of motives, and you know, many of them are complicated, like all of us, but I think all human beings have the capacity to at least listen, and sometimes if they don't change completely, at least somewhat modify their positions, particularly if they are approached with a reasonable argument. Now, I was very interested to see Audrey Silk when she always makes very, very interesting comments, and that comment on the Gary Goldman movie, The Darkest Hour, with Winston Churchill. She points out how silly it is to, at the end of a movie which is all about war, about the massive destruction of property, the massive loss of life, the unbelievable deprivations that people are facing, assaults on every aspect of life, that at the end of the movie maker feels compelled to say this movie doesn't endorse smoking. Here you have a movie that's about war between the Allies and the Axis powers, and the anti-smoking campaign is so single-minded that the movie maker feels compelled to warn people about smoking, as if that's a real danger relative to world destruction, which of course was part of the whole Second World War, and God forbid any other war that's that's going to be anywhere near something like that. I was very happy again on our sidewalk butlers to finally hear back from Councillor Mark McGovern that we will be able to do some work on those, situating them better, and hopefully getting smokers to use them here, particularly in Central Square, which is where the pilot project is supposed to be. Because if for no other reason than by throwing cigarette butts on the street, it helps anti-smoking campaigners foment animosity towards smokers, which of course is one of their big tools. Well, thank you for watching the smoking section. We'll be on next Wednesday, and Happy New Year.